In the early hours of the Second World War's most decisive months, while bombs fell on Europe and entire nations held their breath, a silent battle unfolded far from the front lines. It was not fought with tanks or rifles, but with words, pressure, and clashing visions of leadership. At the center of it stood two men who were supposed to embody unity: Winston Churchill and Dwight D. Eisenhower. What few people realize is how close their conflict came to tearing the Allied command apart at the very moment when unity mattered most. This is a real story of power, ego, strategy, and restraint. And as you listen, ask yourself one question. If you had been in Eisenhower's place, would you have resisted the pressure, or would you have given in? Leave your thoughts in the comments as you listen, because this story forces us to confront how fragile victory truly was. If this kind of historical story helps you see the past with new eyes, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your perspective in the comments. Your engagement keeps stories like this alive. By the year 1943, the Allies had finally begun to turn the tide of the war. The United States had entered the conflict with enormous industrial power. Britain had survived the Blitz, and the idea of a cross-channel invasion was no longer a distant dream. But beneath the surface, tensions were growing. Winston Churchill, Britain's indomitable wartime leader, had a vision shaped by decades of imperial experience and the scars of the First World War. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American Supreme Allied Commander, represented a new kind of leadership: pragmatic, coalition-focused, and determined to keep egos from derailing the mission. Churchill believed that Britain's survival had been earned through suffering and sacrifice, and that this gave him moral authority over Allied strategy. He favored operations in the Mediterranean, pushing through Italy and the Balkans, believing this approach would weaken Germany while limiting catastrophic losses. Eisenhower, under pressure from American leadership and military planners, was committed to a direct assault on Western Europe. He believed that delaying a full invasion would only prolong the war and increase the overall cost in lives. At first, these disagreements appeared manageable. Strategic debates were expected at that level. But Churchill's pressure soon crossed a dangerous line. He did not simply argue his case. He applied relentless personal influence. Private meetings, urgent cables, emotional appeals, and subtle reminders of Britain's sacrifices became routine. To Churchill, Eisenhower was inexperienced, a general who needed guidance. To Eisenhower, Churchill was slowly undermining the very principle of unified command. The problem was not disagreement itself, but how it was expressed. Churchill frequently bypassed Eisenhower by communicating directly with American political leaders, including President Roosevelt. Each message carried an implicit suggestion that Eisenhower might not be fully capable of managing such a vast coalition war. These moves placed Eisenhower in an impossible position. If he pushed back too hard, he risked fracturing the alliance. If he yielded, he risked losing control of the entire operation. Inside Eisenhower's headquarters, the tension was palpable. Staff officers worried that strategic decisions were becoming political compromises rather than military necessities. British and American officers began to align themselves quietly along national lines. The Allied command, designed to be a single coordinated force, was beginning to show cracks. Eisenhower understood something crucial that Churchill, for all his brilliance, sometimes overlooked. The Allied war effort depended not on brilliance alone, but on trust. Once that trust was damaged, no amount of speeches or victories could fully restore it. Eisenhower believed that if the Allies appeared divided, Germany would exploit that division mercilessly. Churchill, meanwhile, felt cornered by history. He carried the memory of Gallipoli, a disastrous campaign from the First World War that had stained his reputation for decades. He feared repeating such a catastrophe with a premature invasion of France. His pressure on Eisenhower was fueled not only by strategy, but by fear of another historical failure that would define his legacy. By late 1943, the situation had reached a critical point. Eisenhower faced mounting interference, rising doubts among his own commanders, and the constant sense that his authority was being quietly eroded. Decisions that should have been straightforward were now weighed down by political consequences. The Allied command was still intact, but only just. What neither man could fully see at that moment was how close they were to a breaking point that might have altered the course of the war itself. And as preparations intensified for the most dangerous operation of the conflict, the pressure did not ease. It increased. The next phase of this story would test Eisenhower's resolve, Churchill's influence, and the very idea of unified command under fire, and it would force a decision that could not be undone once made. As 1944 approached, the pressure surrounding Eisenhower intensified in ways that few outside his inner circle ever understood. Every meeting carried hidden weight. Every strategic discussion felt like a test of authority. Churchill was no longer simply proposing alternatives. He was pressing relentlessly, convinced that history would punish hesitation more than delay. And in doing so, he placed Eisenhower in the most dangerous position a coalition commander can face, being second-guessed from above while expected to command absolutely from below. The core of the conflict centered on timing and control. Eisenhower insisted that the invasion of Western Europe had to be decisive, concentrated, and executed under a single chain of command. He knew from experience that divided authority in battle led to hesitation, confusion, and disaster. Churchill, however, feared that Eisenhower's plan risked repeating the slaughter of the trenches from the previous World War. To him, Normandy was not just a battlefield, it was a potential graveyard for an entire generation. Churchill's interventions became more personal. He requested direct access to operational details that traditionally fell under Eisenhower's authority. He questioned landing zones, force allocation, and even the choice of commanders. These were not casual suggestions. They came wrapped in urgency, authority, and the unmistakable tone of a man who believed he carried the weight of Britain's survival on his shoulders. Eisenhower felt the ground shifting beneath him. The Supreme Allied commander was expected to project calm certainty, yet behind closed doors he wrestled with doubt, not about the mission, but about whether he could maintain unity long enough to carry it out. His greatest fear was not defeat on the beaches, but collapse in the command structure before the first soldier even landed. Inside the Allied headquarters, whispers grew louder. British officers worried that American planners underestimated German defenses. American officers suspected that Britain was deliberately delaying the invasion to protect its empire and preserve influence in Europe. These suspicions, whether fair or not, poisoned trust. Eisenhower spent countless hours mediating arguments that had little to do with tactics and everything to do with national pride. Churchill, sensing resistance, increased the pressure. He warned of political consequences, of parliamentary backlash, of public outrage if the invasion failed. He reminded Eisenhower that Britain had been fighting alone when the United States was still debating entry into the war. Each reminder was true, and each carried emotional force, but taken together, they threatened to undermine Eisenhower's authority at the worst possible moment. At one particularly tense point, Eisenhower considered resignation, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a calculated move. He believed that if he could not exercise clear command, stepping aside might prevent deeper fractures. The fact that such a thought even crossed his mind reveals how severe the situation had become. A resignation would have sent shockwaves through the Allied world and signaled to Germany that unity was an illusion. President Roosevelt watched closely. He trusted Eisenhower, but he also understood Churchill's fears. Roosevelt's role became one of quiet balance, refusing to openly side with either man, while urging cooperation behind the scenes. This delicate political dance prevented an immediate rupture, but it did not resolve the underlying tension. What made the situation truly tragic was that both men were acting in good faith. Churchill's pressure came from fear of catastrophe. Eisenhower's resistance came from fear of chaos. Both were right in their own way, yet neither could fully yield without risking everything they were trying to protect. As the invasion plan solidified, the stakes rose beyond strategy. The credibility of Allied leadership itself was on trial. Soldiers preparing for battle needed to believe that their commanders spoke with one voice. Any hint of division could spread uncertainty faster than enemy propaganda. Eisenhower ultimately made a quiet but firm decision. He would listen. He would compromise where possible, but he would not surrender command. The invasion would proceed under unified authority, or not at all. It was a line drawn not on paper, but in principle. The consequences of that decision would soon become impossible to avoid. And as the final preparations moved forward, Churchill faced a choice of his own: continue pressing until the command fractured, or step back and trust a man younger, calmer, and far less theatrical than himself. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and once crossed there would be no turning back. As the final months before the invasion unfolded, the atmosphere inside the Allied command grew increasingly fragile. Every delay, every revision to the plan seemed to validate Churchill's deepest fears, and test Eisenhower's patience. What outwardly appeared as methodical preparation was internally a constant struggle to keep authority intact without humiliating a powerful ally whose voice still carried enormous global weight. Churchill did not withdraw his influence easily. He continued to raise concerns about weather, intelligence reliability, and the risk of German counterattacks. At times, his interventions bordered on the operational, as if he were attempting to shape the invasion directly from London. Eisenhower recognized the danger immediately. If Churchill succeeded in redefining the limits of civilian influence over military command, the unified structure would become symbolic rather than real. The strain began to show in Eisenhower himself. Those close to him noticed the toll it took. He slept poorly, smoked constantly, and carried the burden of knowing that any misstep would be blamed not just on strategy, but on leadership. A failed invasion would not simply cost lives, it would validate every doubt Churchill had expressed and fracture the alliance beyond repair. Meanwhile, British and American commanders sensed that history was pressing in on them. Field Marshal Montgomery, one of Churchill's favored generals, became an indirect focal point of the tension. His confidence and outspoken nature reassured Churchill, but unsettled American officers who feared that Montgomery's influence might tilt operational control back toward British hands. Eisenhower, caught between personalities, worked tirelessly to maintain balance without surrendering authority. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower delivered one of the most decisive statements of his career. He made it clear that once the invasion date was set, interference would end. Strategic debate would give way to execution. Any attempt to override that decision would force a reckoning no one truly wanted. It was not a threat spoken aloud to Churchill, but its meaning reached him nonetheless. For Churchill, this moment was deeply unsettling. He had spent his life shaping events through force of will, words, and relentless persuasion. To step back now felt like surrendering control at the climax of his life's greatest struggle. Yet he also understood that pushing further could expose divisions that Germany would eagerly exploit. The fate of Europe rested not only on courage at the front, but restraint at the top. The invasion date approached, and the weather became a cruel wildcard. Storms battered the Channel, reinforcing Churchill's anxiety and fueling last-minute doubts. He urged delay, caution, and reconsideration. Eisenhower listened, weighed the intelligence, and ultimately accepted the risk. It was a decision that could not be reversed and could not be shared. The responsibility was his alone. In the final hours before the invasion, Eisenhower carried a handwritten note in his pocket, prepared to take full blame if the operation failed. That note symbolized everything at stake, not just military defeat but the survival of Allied unity. Churchill, informed but no longer directing, watched events unfold with a mixture of fear, pride, and resignation. When the invasion finally began, the world saw unity in motion. What it did not see was how close that unity had come to collapse under pressure. Churchill's voice had nearly reshaped command. Eisenhower's restraint had nearly cost him his position. And yet, through an uneasy balance of resolve and concession, the alliance held together just long enough to change history. The aftermath of those days would redefine the relationship between the two men forever. But the true cost of that near fracture would only become clear later, when silence replaced debate and victory forced reflection. After the invasion was underway, and the initial chaos began to settle into a brutal rhythm of advance and resistance, the tension between Churchill and Eisenhower did not simply disappear. Victory did not erase memory, it merely postponed the reckoning. Behind public displays of unity, both men carried the weight of what had almost happened, and what might still unravel if old habits returned. Churchill resumed his role as the voice of defiance and inspiration to the public, but privately, he struggled with the reality that operational control had slipped beyond his reach. For the first time in his career, he was forced to accept that influence did not always translate into authority. This was not an easy adjustment for a man who had shaped national destiny through sheer force of personality. His frustration surfaced in subtle ways, probing questions, pointed remarks, and renewed concern over strategic direction beyond the beaches. Eisenhower, now fully tested by war, grew more resolute. The near collapse of the Allied command had hardened his understanding of leadership. He no longer viewed unity as a given, but as something that had to be actively protected from ambition, fear, and national pride. Every success on the battlefield reinforced his belief that unified command was not merely a structure, but a discipline that demanded constant restraint from all involved. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, new disagreements emerged. Churchill advocated bold moves towards Central Europe and the Balkans, hoping to shape the post-war balance of power. Eisenhower focused on defeating Germany as efficiently as possible, resisted being drawn into political maneuvering that could complicate military objectives. The old fault lines reappeared, but this time the boundaries were clearer. What prevented another crisis was the memory of how close they had come to disaster. Churchill understood now that pressing too far risked isolating Britain within its own alliance. Eisenhower understood that dismissing Churchill entirely would fracture trust at the highest political level. Each man adjusted, not out of friendship, but necessity. Yet the emotional cost lingered. Eisenhower never forgot how his authority had been tested at the most critical moment of the war. Churchill never forgot the feeling of standing on the edge of history, unable to steer it directly. Their relationship became formal, cautious, and defined by mutual respect rather than warmth. Among Allied officers, the story of those months became an unspoken lesson. Unity was not automatic, even among allies fighting a common enemy. It was fragile, vulnerable to ego and fear, and dependent on leaders willing to absorb personal risk for the greater good. Eisenhower's willingness to shoulder responsibility and Churchill's eventual restraint became as important to victory as any battlefield maneuver. As Germany's defeat approached, the narrative shifted toward triumph. Public memory favored speeches, flags, and celebrations, but beneath the surface, the Allied leadership knew that victory had come at the edge of fracture. One wrong decision, one final act of pressure, could have rewritten the outcome of the war. When the war in Europe finally ended, Churchill and Eisenhower stood as symbols of Allied success. Yet the silence between them spoke volumes. The pressure that had nearly split the command left scars that history rarely acknowledges. It was a reminder that the most dangerous battles are sometimes fought not against enemies, but within alliances themselves. The full meaning of that near collapse would only become clear in the years that followed, when both men reflected on leadership, responsibility, and the price of unity under pressure. In the years after the war, the world remembered victory, but rarely examined how close it had come to unraveling from within. Churchill returned to politics with his legendary voice intact, yet something fundamental had shifted. The war had taught him that influence, no matter how powerful, has limits when survival depends on collective command. His post-war reflections carried a quieter tone, shaped by the memory of restraint forced upon him at the height of his authority. Eisenhower, by contrast, emerged from the conflict profoundly changed. The pressure he endured during those critical months became the foundation of his leadership philosophy. When he later assumed the presidency, he carried with him an unshakable belief that unity must be protected even when disagreement is justified. The near fracture of the Allied command was never far from his mind. It taught him that leadership is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to prevent conflict from becoming destruction. Historians would later debate who was right. Some argue that Churchill's caution could have spared lives. Others insist that Eisenhower's resolve shortened the war. But this debate misses the deeper truth. The tragedy was not that they disagreed. The tragedy was how close their disagreement came to dismantling the very structure that made victory possible. What saved the Allied command was not a dramatic confrontation or a final concession, but something far rarer in wartime leadership: restraint. Eisenhower restrained his authority just enough to preserve trust. Churchill restrained his influence just enough to preserve unity. That fragile balance held, not because it was perfect, but because failure was unthinkable. The soldiers who crossed beaches and fought through hedgerows never knew how narrowly their leaders avoided division. They believed in a unified command because it appeared unified. That illusion of certainty was itself a strategic weapon. Had it broken, doubt could have spread faster than any enemy advance. The story of Churchill's pressure and Eisenhower's resistance is a reminder that history is shaped as much by what does not happen as by what does. The Allied command did not split. Eisenhower did not resign. Churchill did not force his will to the breaking point. Each of these absences changed the course of the 20th century. In the end, the tragedy lies in how invisible that danger remains. We celebrate decisive battles and famous speeches, but rarely honor the moments when leaders chose restraint over ego. Yet it was in those moments, behind closed doors and unrecorded conversations, that the fate of the free world was quietly decided. This is why their story still matters. It teaches that unity under pressure is not a natural state, but a choice made repeatedly, often at great personal cost. And it reminds us that even the strongest alliances can fracture if leadership forgets that victory depends not only on strength, but on trust. The Allied command survived because two men, shaped by fear, ambition, and responsibility, stepped back from the edge. History moved forward because they did not.